The international system is facing accelerated transitions as competition between the great powers intensifies. Join this important dialogue with the Kingston Consortium on International Security.
Good afternoon. Welcome back to day 2 of KCIS. This afternoon's panel is Allied Experiences and Coordinated Response, chaired by Dr. Stephanie von Lackey. Before we proceed though, I'll just remind you that simultaneous translation is available and it can be accessed by selecting the globe on the bottom right-hand side of your screen. And to submit questions, simply use the question and answer function at the top of your screen and our panel chair will receive these. By way of introduction, Dr. Stephanie von Lackey is Director for the Center for International and Defense Policy and the Canada Research Chair on Gender Security and the Armed Forces. She's been employed as the Executive Director for the Center for International Peace and Security Studies. She's held positions at Georgetown University, the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, Dartmouth College, ETH Zurich, and was a Fulbright Visiting Research Chair at the University of Southern California. Dr. von Lackey is the founder of the Women in International Security Canada. She's an honorary Lieutenant Colonel of the Princes of Wales One Regiment and the co-host of the Security and Defense podcast, Battle Rhythm. It is my pleasure to hand the floor over to Dr. Stephanie von Lackey.
Thank you so much, Colonel Teller, for this kind introduction. I am so pleased to be chairing panel 2 on Allied Experiences and Coordinated Responses. This panel is really about showcasing the experiences of allies and partners in terms of pandemic response, and especially zoning in on that role for the National Armed Forces. We have different regional and country expertise on this panel and perspectives from the research world, the military, and NATO. The panelists are uniquely positioned to talk about some of the civil-military cooperation and coordination challenges, how the pandemic has affected multinational environments, the variety of mechanisms that are used to facilitate pandemic response in different contexts, but also how adversaries can exploit the vulnerabilities exposed by the pandemic crisis. This is a very important conversation to have if we're trying to draw out the lessons learned for future national and global emergencies, and we are. So each speaker will talk for approximately 15 minutes, and then we'll leave time for a Q&A segment at the end. I'll start by introducing the panel in the order that you have on your program. So I'll introduce the 4 speakers, and you will, of course, have the full bios online in the KCIS program. I won't read them in full. So we have 4 panelists. We'll be starting with Major General Michel-Henri Saint-Louis. And Major General Saint-Louis has been the acting commander of the Canadian Army since April 2021. Before then, he was the commander of the Canadian Army Doctrine and Training Center, our KCIS partner, coming to CATDC after commanding Joint Task Force Impact, Canada's largest deployed joint force that provides, from Kuwait, the national command and control node to capacity building efforts in Iraq, Lebanon, and Jordan. Next, we have Elizabeth Braw, who is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where she focuses on defense against gray zone threats. Before joining the American Enterprise Institute, Elizabeth was a senior research fellow at RUSI, leading the Modern Deterrence Project. And prior to that, she worked at Control Risks, a global risk consultancy. I'll also mention that Ms. Braw has a new book out called The Defender's Dilemma. It just came out last month. Congratulations. Following Ms. Braw, we have Mr. Tim Lannon, and he is joining us from Brussels, where he works at the NATO headquarters in the Operations Division. In his capacity as head of NATO's Euro-Atlantic Disaster Response Coordination Center, he brings really a unique perspective on Allied coordination during the pandemic. Mr. Lannon, who is also a retired senior officer from the Canadian Armed Forces, was awarded the NATO Meritorious Service Medal following his deployment to Kabul, Afghanistan, where he supported the evacuation of NATO-affiliated Afghans and their families. Our 4th panelist is Professor Beth Greener, who is an associate professor in politics and international relations with 3 books and numerous articles and chapters under her belt. Dr. Greener is currently New Zealand's ASEAN Regional Forum's eminent expert representative, has been a member of the UN Police Division's International Policing Advisory Council, is a guest lecturer at the New Zealand Defence Force Command and Staff College, and regularly engages in a rank of Track 2 and Track 1.5 diplomatic events across the Asia-Pacific region. So 4 wonderful experts, and we'll kick things off with Major General St. Louis. Over to you.
Bonjour, Stephanie et tout le monde.
Hello, Stephanie, and everyone watching us this afternoon.
I'm completely dislocated. Like, I was reading the agenda and I thought I was going to be 4th. I thought I was going to get to listen to Elizabeth, Tim, and others. I was looking forward to listening to Tim Lannon, who has been a teammate of mine when we were both majors in Kabul in 2006. And then, as everyone would say good ideas, I would just jot them down and come at the end with only a couple of minutes left and say, agree, 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 open for questions. Je suis, yeah, thank you so much for making me go first. Really appreciate that. But in our seriousness, thank you for bringing this conference together. I remember one of our first conversations on an MS Team call with the commander of the Canadian Army's Command and Staff College, and us trying to envision what would KCIS look at this year, COVID, no COVID, in-house, not in-house, and from a discussion, a brainstorming on what we should be talking about, to yesterday having a keynote address by General Eyre, listening to some of the tail end of the previous panel of Madame West and Monsieur Junot there, and you asking me to speak. Like, absolutely félicitations à toute l'équipe that went from
congratulations to the entire team.
The pandemic through the adversity, and now you're delivering a novel, agile conference on 3 days in small chunks virtually. And I'm looking forward to hearing, how did that come about? Was that a success? How do we go forward? Hybrid in the future, in presence, virtual, etc. Donc, je commence en vous disant félicitations.
I start by saying congratulations, and I want to also apologize. I want to apologize from the get-go.
Switch languages. I was like just outside the office, officers walking in, telling me what to do, what not to do, and they're like, "Sir, can you not go back and forth?" And you are asking me to put the bar very high. I can barely speak English. I don't know if you noticed through my little Francophone accent here. I have a mother tongue that's not French or English, having been born in Nicaragua. I barely am cognizant or coherent in French, and go from French to English on a regular basis. It is proof of the laziness of my brain and my espousing of the Sun Tzu principle of the indirect approach, where I take the path of least resistance as the ideas form in my brain. So, je vous le dis tout de suite, l'équipe d'interprètes.
I want to tell you right away, it's not going to be easy on the interpreters. The next 10 minutes are going to be painful.
You're trying to switch from one to the other. Just get comfortable with that button of simultaneous translation. But I will try to not change too much when there's important words, which, hey, there won't be that many important words in the next 10 minutes. I would suggest you pay attention to the other speakers that come next. What I'm going to do is I'll divide my next 7-8 minutes in 3 blocks. I've been asked to talk on the subject of the panel, our allied experiences, and Stephanie and others thought that I would have something to contribute. I don't know what they were thinking, but I will give you 3 perspectives. My perspective when I was deployed as a Joint Task Force Commander in Kuwait, in charge of the Canadian Armed Forces presence across 5 countries, as these 5 countries were tackling the pandemic in January, February 2020, and then March 2020, when everything shut down across the globe. I will talk to you about my perspective on allied experiences as the person in charge of Army training. And I came back to a different Canada that I left 3 years before, and I came back to be in charge of Army training, and the perspective of how the pandemic has affected that endeavor. And then from 200 days in being in charge of Army training to now 200 days, 180 days being in charge of the Army in an acting capacity. Par intérim, en français, ça veut dire not a big deal.
Acting, right? Not a big deal.
I'll give you a couple of points on my perspective from the acting command of the Canadian Army. And I'll make 3 points in each and see if those have any sticking power in your conversation, and look forward to the other panelists' comments and then questions. From a deployed commander's perspective, I would say 3 things. First is the realization of the unknown and how human beings react to the unknown, react to fear, react to uncertainty, and how as a deployed commander, as part of a coalition, national commander, but also part of a coalition, how you have to navigate uncertainty. And there might be some lessons to take away from that. At least there's some internal lessons, and I will make that point that will dovetail every one of those observations. So first, say l'incertitude, le besoin.
So uncertainty, the need to consider the unknown in the deployment and to do it in partnership with our allies when we're deployed.
Easier for me to say it to you today than it was in January and February 2020. Second observation as a deployed Joint Force commander is that very quickly, in the face of the unknown and uncertainty, national interests come to the forefront. And while we might play nice, where we have common national interest, a common adversary, or we have reinforcing interest in the achievement of something, faced with the uncertainty of the pandemic, it was fascinating to see how the world quickly went back to protecting its own national interests, and maybe the collaboration, coordination, contribution, the sharing of national power was different in March 2020 than it was when I started my tour in May 2019. The third observation from a deployed perspective, as the Joint Task Force commander in that tour, la raison d'être de la mission était de faire...
The reason behind the mission was to build capacity.
Of what we were doing in Jordan, in Lebanon, in Iraq, in addition to providing a regional footprint and presence for the Canadian Armed Forces and Canadian national interests. But if you are in a capacity building mission, capacity building in the land domain is a people mission, is a people endeavor. It's a people activity. It's a presence and physical activity. In a pandemic that forces you to be away from each other, separate from each other, isolated from each other, does not bode well for a mission that requires a human contact. And all through this, if you want to navigate these 3 points, it screams for the need for resiliency within your troops. I come back to Canada, to a different Canada. I had left Canada to be the deputy of a US Army Corps in the Pacific Northwest. And then from there, I deployed 14 months to the Middle East. So I come back to Canada that is under lockdown, that is under isolation rules, that is under a different reality than when I left. And under that construct, I realized that Army training is a human endeavor. Just like I realized that downrange when I was actually delivering capacity building effects and could not do it, I come back to a Canadian Army training construct that needs to have soldiers side by sides to learn what it means to soldier. Officers teaching young officer cadets, NCOs teaching new soldiers. And if you cannot do the teaching side by side, hands-on, physical contact to the tools of the trade, il y a une difficulté à passer ces connaissances-là.
It's quite a hurdle.
Army training required agility in thinking, in delivery of that training. If you do not have that contact with each other, if because of the pandemic, you have had to deliver training differently, you have to accept that you deliver training differently. And if you used to learn and teach something a certain way, the pandemic has certainly shown us that you can teach and deliver something a different way. And I think it has opened our eyes towards what is possible. Et peut-être avant, before we said, you can only learn how to be a platoon commander, a troop leader, a certain way. I think we now accept that there are different ways because we have seen different ways. The third point from an Army training perspective is we cannot afford another dip in the generation of Army readiness. The fact that we stopped or slowed down, the fact that we had to rethink, the fact that we had to separate ourselves from each other for a while, and that dip that it caused in the generation of land readiness. That hollow bubble is going to stay in the system. If you think of it as a hydraulic system, on a mis une bulle, we put a bubble in that cannot be filled easily. And I would say that one of the takeaways for me is that that hydraulic system cannot afford a number of these bubbles. One bubble, you might be able to bleed it out eventually, and we're hard at work to reconstitute the calf. But if you continue to inject these bubbles of hollowness, of slowing down and stopping training, Army readiness cannot recover easily. And in order to be able to deliver on the training in a different way without inserting new bubbles, what do you need? You need resiliency. You need resilient soldiers and leaders that can adapt and adjust. And if I go to my third kind of observation from an Army commander's perspective, the Canadian experience of the last 18, 20 months points to an ongoing, even growing requirement for Canadian Army capabilities. I could not have envisioned 24 months ago of dividing the battle space in Montreal or in Toronto, assign it to combat arms leaders that then would have to go into des endroits de soins de longue durée pour des personnes.
Where people would be faced with long-term care facilities and the elderly.
The security of these establishments. And who did we have in charge? We had combat arms majors that would divide the battle space on the island of Montreal and then assign healthcare professionals, but also general service soldiers from the Army to do that. I would not have envisioned the Rangers being employed the way they are employed. I would not have envisioned having been sent to the border to help CBSA in controlling our border. I would not have envisioned the number of tasks that are new, that were not in my platoon commander's handbook of what I needed to be good at when I graduated from Gagetown infantry training in '92. Being ready to intervene during a pandemic was not in the books. So what the Army has these ready, able teams that are self-contained, can communicate with each other, can operate independently, and can go with credibility to do what is asked of them. My takeaway is that what the Army has to offer will be in more and more demand going forward. The two last points is that it puts this heavy burden on the Army. If we have to be ready for these new and different types of tasks, what does it mean for my readiness to face combat? And how do I leverage readiness to face combat, be ready to warfight, and leveraging that for whatever new task comes to being? It does put a heavy burden on our leaders in their employment. Qu'est-ce qu'ils font à tous les jours pour être
what they do every day to be ready, and how ready can they be?
By this new set of requirements that we are putting on the Army. But it highlights the fragility of our national resilience, the requirement to go help a number of other ministries and departments, highlight that our country, this just-in-time delivery of our things, this mindset of efficiency, doesn't make us very redundant, doesn't have much resiliency in the system. And if there isn't resiliency in the system, then what do you need? I would suggest that for the Army, the takeaway is what you need is a very resilient Canadian Army, a very resilient set of soldiers, of leaders, of equipment, of formed teams that can go and face whatever adversity unknown today, facing going into the future. So this need for the Canadian Army resiliency is my overall takeaway from observations from a joint force, from a training perspective, and from a currently acting Army commander's perspective. And with that, I look forward to the comments from the other panelists and hopefully all the hard questions going to the other experts and not me. Merci beaucoup, Madame, et votre audience.
Thank you very much to everybody in the audience.
You put me as the first panelist. Over.
Merci beaucoup, Mon Général. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, General.
For the kind words, for your ongoing support of this conference, and for your extreme displays of humility. Your thoughts on being a deployed commander and seeing this shift pre-COVID, post-COVID, the impact on the training environment, and also your broader perspective as Army commander and how the dip in readiness, is really something to pay attention to. Echoing some of the comments made by General Eyre yesterday, were all very important points to underscore. And I think that as we move to our second panelist, Elizabeth Braw from the American Enterprise Institute, we have a fairly smooth segue, because I know that she has some thoughts on how the military is employed in the pandemic context, and also underscoring the importance of resilience. Elizabeth, over to you.
Thank you very much. I will spare you any efforts to switch between languages. That was really quite a virtuosic performance we just heard. So if you wonder about the background here, I'm sitting in a conference center in the Dutch countryside, where the Dutch Army has its annual leadership conference for colonels and brigadiers, and of course the senior leadership is here as well. And that's a sign, I think, of how interest in societal resilience is shifting. I guess I should check with the Dutch Army whether they would have thought of inviting me 5 years ago, but I wasn't invited, so I think they didn't think of it then. And now I'm here because national security is changing, and so is the way in which the armed forces and the army in various countries in particular think about their role and what it is they're supposed to do. And a major wake-up call really was COVID-19. And when it struck, it's fair to say that not a single Western country, or indeed any other country, had any comprehensive contingency planning. In the UK, for example, which is where I was living then, the UK prides itself of fusion doctrine and the whole of government approach, and that was a key a pillar of the 2007 National Security Strategy, and the UK government thought it was incredibly innovative. Then comes COVID-19. Oh, and by the way, this fusion doctrine included a really quite good pandemic exercise, but involving the whole of government and nobody else. And so COVID-19 struck, and what happened? The government, had a somewhat good idea of what it needed to do, although it never really followed up on that pandemic exercise a couple of years earlier. But the rest of society didn't have the foggiest idea what to do. So people went, they panicked, they stockpiled when they didn't need to stockpile, which caused enormous product shortages. And it was actually quite depressing going to the supermarket. If you went at 5 o'clock, or indeed any time after 8 o'clock in the morning, there was nothing to be had. And I remember thinking that this reminded me of East Germany, which had the great fortune to visit while it still existed. So it's a good point of comparison. But the point is, wider society didn't have the foggiest idea of what to do. Companies hadn't prepared for this sort of meltdown, and of course the public hadn't been prepared. And so the UK government, as did most other governments, the UK government turned to the armed forces to help. And it turned to the armed forces to conduct testing, to drive oxygen around the country, to drive respirators around the country, to drive PPE around the country. And of course, this PPE had to be ordered. And the armed forces helped with that too, because in the UK, there is something called the Engineering and Logistic and Engineering Staff Corps, which is a volunteer organization. It's business leaders volunteering for the British Army. They are commissioned officers, but they are not part of the reserve. And what they do is they volunteer their skills in the private sector. So these, I think it's about 65 of them now. These 65 members of what is called the Staff Corps for short, they tapped into their business contacts to help the government get some supplies here and there of oxygen and other critical products and goods. But the point is, all through COVID-19, the UK government relied on the armed forces and the army in particular to be the emergency response team to whatever crisis came up. And that is something that's happened increasingly. I remember, for example, the 2012 Olympic Games in London, when the contract for security of the Olympic sites somehow fell through at the last moment. And what happened? Well, the government turned to, or the organizers asked the government to send in the army, which the government did. So we had army soldiers checking bags at Olympic sites. That's great, but and nobody would, I think, have said no, the army shouldn't help the Olympics. It was a great success in the end. But the point is, it's yet another illustration of how dependent we have become on the armed forces for contingencies of all kinds, not just war. And we're seeing the same thing in other countries. The armed forces were asked to help all over Europe, not as large an extent as was the case in the UK. But for example, in Germany, they did a fantastic job testing, assisting healthcare providers. And by the way, that was of course the case in the UK as well, that military planners were asked to help the government planning. And in Germany, they also set up Germany's first 24-hour vaccination center. Fantastic. But my point is that it's great that we can do it. But what happens if we need the armed forces for something other than doing our civil contingencies work? Then we are stuck. And I think that is the dilemma that we have now, that the armed forces are really good and everybody loves it when they help during a pandemic or indeed any other crisis. But what if they are needed in the area that they really specialize in, which is where we as civilians really can't do anything, which is armed conflict? Then we have essentially spoiled ourselves to the point where we are helpless. And this is the point where we need to think about how do we develop. The previous speaker mentioned resilience in the armed forces. I think what we need even more than that is resilience in civil society, so that we don't always turn to the armed forces because we know that we can. Yes, we can, but it's a luxury that we can't afford. I think as the world is becoming more and more confrontational, and where we can, I think, safely assume that other countries will try to use other means, a range of means against us. So I sound here like somebody who's criticizing the armed forces for doing a great job during the pandemic. Extremely depressing. But the point is, they did a fantastic job. We just shouldn't get used to them doing that fantastic job. We should try to do a fantastic job ourselves. And if we get around to discussing more, I would love to explore how the rest of society can get involved. But on that hopefully positive note, I'll hand over to the next speaker.
Thank you so much. I think it is a very important question to pose as we draw out the broader implications of the pandemic. So yes, we're still very much in the midst of COVID-19, but we need to think about the lessons learned for the future and asking this question of, are we over-reliant on the military for managing these crises when they arise, both nationally and globally? I think is one that we'll pin on the wall there, because it should definitely foster some conversation and deeper reflection on our part. Next, we have Tim Lannon, who is joining us from Brussels, where he works at the NATO headquarters. So where he's sitting, he's had really a unique perspective in terms of various mechanisms for coordination, cooperation between allies and partners. So Tim, thank you so much for calling in from Brussels today. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Okay, just 1 second. Okay, thanks very much for the invite to be on this panel. It's a privilege and an honor for me to be on a panel. And unlike Major General St. Louis, I am bilingual too, but it's not French and English. I speak civil military, which has been critically important in this environment. So Allied military forces played a crucial role in reinforcing civilian responses to the crisis. Over 500,000 troops across the alliance assisted their governments in the fight against the virus. They've flown medical personnel, transported tons of medical equipment and supplies, and helped to build field hospitals. So in the end, allies and partners were helping one another. So for structure, I'll try to keep it in general, I'll talk about the EADRCC, the Euro-Atlantic Disaster Response and Coordination Center itself, and I'll give an overview of the mechanism we use to provide assistance to others during crises. I'll talk about some of the civil-military coordination dynamics amongst the allies and partners. And I'll go through some of the challenges for NATO in responding during COVID. And I'll wrap up with a few lessons and observations that will help us move forward in the against any crisis, not just pandemics. But the Euro-Atlantic Disaster Response and Coordination Center I'll first and foremost say that the number of people here at the conference in attendance is probably more than the number of people that knew about the EADRCC prior to the pandemic. So the pandemic itself, or sorry, the EADRCC itself, it's been in existence since 1999. It was actually a Russian proposal that NATO gets involved in disaster response and crisis management. So our role is to facilitate civil military support in response to natural and man-made disasters, crises, including during Article 5 situations. So for from 1999 to the beginning of 2020, we were involved in forest fires, floods, earthquakes, hurricanes, a similar health crisis back in 2014, pandemics, and a refugee crisis as well. So our organization, our mechanism, we respond to requests for assistance from 30 allies and 39 partners, as well as international organizations. We respond, and we can activate ourselves without a council decision. The only thing that goes on at NATO without the required council decision. So that's important to note too. Primarily because we can respond immediately, and we turn around requests for assistance from stricken nations within 24 hours. That's our mandate, to do it within 24 hours, but quite often they're turned around within a very short 2-hour window. So we facilitate and broker offers of assistance from allies and partners and respond to the request for assistance. As I mentioned, prior to the pandemic, on average, we were responding to 3 requests for assistance per year. And during COVID-19, we've responded to over 30 requests for assistance from allies and partners. Some allies and partners have requested assistance more than once. But all these requests for assistance have translated into more than 150 offers of support from allies and partners. So during COVID, not only did we operate our clearinghouse mechanism, but NATO built a stockpile. And it was important because supplies were short at the beginning of the pandemic. And we were in tough competition with other nations and industry to acquire some of those supplies. We established also a trust fund that we can use to purchase goods, medical supplies and equipment, and use it to pay for transportation when required. So that trust fund is coming in handy, and it helps expedite our response time for allies and partners. The NATO military itself prepared an operations plan to execute, to respond as required, and that was mainly focused on coordination, and it could force generate transportation. We did not execute this operations plan, primarily because one of the elements we were missing was military medical personnel. So I think in the end, we had about a 5% fill rate on the force generation of the combined joint statements of requirement for that operations plan. So we were fortunate enough we did not have to launch the operations plan, and others came to assist in where we fell short. The military is also being tasked to develop an overarching pandemic response plan, more a longer term comprehensive plan that can bring to bear all the tools of the greater NATO enterprise to deal with any future pandemic. It will account for all the lessons learned during this crisis. The military were actually tasked to deliver this pandemic response plan in January of 2021. However, we're still in the pandemic and we're still learning a lot of lessons that can be brought forward. So some of the civil military coordination dynamics in the pandemic are ourselves. Understandably, the allies and partners militaries were deeply involved in their own national responses. And we've heard a little bit of this from Major General Saint-Louis, where he talked about it was people, you know, taking care of their own first. And I can get into that in a little bit in the lessons derived, but it was very much a nationalism approach. And where there was spare capacity in some nations, they offered it to others. But it was highly competitive and politicized at many levels. So some of the, one of the requests for assistance we received was from UN OCHA, the United Nations Office of Coordination and Humanitarian Affairs. It's particular, it should be taken note here that UN OCHA always operates on the principle of military as the last resort. Now, the request originated from the World Food Program, and NATO has assisted in, done a lot of work with the World Food Program in the past. Particularly, I can recall in 2010, we flew a lot of flights for the World Food Program to respond to a flood in Pakistan in 2010. We've also worked quite a bit with the World Health Organization, and for the Ebola crisis in 2014 in West Africa, we actually provided some response for the World Health Organization. But for our mandate itself, the UN OCHA can ask for request assistance to the EADRCC, and we do not have to go for a council decision. But the other UN bodies, the World Health Organization, the World Food Program, they cannot come directly to us, or else we would have to go for approval by council. What happened there is UN OCHA brokered the request for assistance on behalf of the World Food Program, and it came to us and we responded. We provided airlift for field hospital to Ghana, and we provided other lift of goods and supplies on behalf of the World Food Program. So it was a very successful civil military cooperation between NATO and international organizations. We also have across the city in Brussels, we have the European Union. The European Union has a similar mechanism of response to the Euro-Atlantic Disaster Response and Coordination Center. It's called the European Union's Emergency Response and Coordination Center. And they respond under their mechanism, the European Union's Civil Protection Mechanism. Huge difference between a nation requesting assistance through the EU and requesting assistance through NATO. A request for assistance through the EU Civil Protection Mechanism, a responding nation, so an offering nation, receives reimbursement for what they offer to the stricken nation. Through the NATO mechanism, it all happens to be costs fall where they lie. So for instance, we've had allies during an earthquake request assistance through the EU mechanism and not our mechanism because they knew they would have a quicker response. And these are one of the things that we can take forward in our lessons learned. So we've had some great cooperation with the other international organizations and regional organizations. And as we move forward, we are looking to tighten our habitual working relationships with the World Food Program and the World Health Organization, in addition to what we already do with the UN OCHA. And we've always had a great coordination mechanism with the EU mechanism as well. So the EU, a lot of people kind of caution duplication of effort, you know, the complementarianism, as well as making sure we're deconflicted. During the COVID crisis, we had weekly calls and irregular calls as well. But just in January of 2021 here, when we compared the list of open requests for assistance, I believe the European Union had 9, we had 13 open requests for assistance. Only 2 nations were on the same list. So, but the nations will request assistance through both organizations as they will for any other crisis. But it was striking to us that at the end of the day, where nations are always worried about duplication of effort, there was only 2 nations on the same list of requestees. There was a shortage of military medical personnel, primarily because most of these were used at the national level. We had developed a concept for a capability, a military medical capability package. And we would have established almost a lift and shift type organization where we had, it was based upon some good medical insight, what would be required for a mobile COVID response. We developed a concept that would have 100 ICU beds, a hospital of 100 ICU beds and 400 quarantine beds. If we listed all the items that we required for that capability, it came to 11 million euros. And that's not much when you consider, you know, just the EU alone, they had nearly a billion euros to spend on COVID response. So when it comes down to the capability was it was very easy to put the capability infrastructure there, but not the people. So we could have deployed the capability, but we didn't have the personnel to go with that. And it was based upon a lift and shift because we had regional hotspots here in Europe. We would have lifted and shifted the COVID capability package to wherever there were hotspots and where it was required. Some of the CivMil Coord issues, I talk here slightly about industry. Industry could not keep up with the pace of the demands. But if you go back to the Cold War period, NATO had what they call civilian wartime agencies. And we had several prearranged contracts that could have been executed specifically for NATO in time of crisis, in time of the Cold War. So this was something that has been long forgotten since the days of the Cold War. One of the benefits of the Euro-Atlantic Disaster Response and Coordination Center is we deal with multiple ministries in nations, ministries other than defense. So when, and our only issue there is that several nations are not centrally coordinating themselves. So we might have a request for assistance from Ukraine, and I just use this as an example, don't take it so country X, their Ministry of Health may be requesting assistance through us. And country X, their Ministry of Interior may be requesting assistance through us. And we have to turn around and tell the nation it needs to be coordinated, and so it's one nation, one request. So then let me go through some of the challenges that we have had. Of course, we talk about supply chain security and the outpacing industry with the demands coming from others. Competition, and it's very, Elizabeth mentioned it before too, a lot of stuff became very politicized during the COVID-19 response. Vaccines, assistance. We operated on from our pandemic response trust fund. we only delivered projects to nations who had open requests for assistance through us. So we had no political aspirations. It wasn't, okay, this country gets it and this country doesn't. And so we were trying to just ensure that we were unpoliticized in our own response. I know I'm getting short on time here, but I'll wrap up with a couple lessons. Can't stress enough the previous two speakers talking about resilience. Major General St. Louis talking about resilience army. That's correct. But what we do need to look at is more resilient, not just societies, but resilient governments. So, and the NATO has guidelines on national resilience, but resilience is a national responsibility. So we refer to them as guidelines for national resilience. The stockpile, if we had had a stockpile prior to the pandemic, we may have been able to respond a lot quicker. Now, the European Union has a rescue stockpile, which has a number of goods in there that they can quickly respond to forest fires, floods, and hurricanes and earthquakes. NATO has nothing in a stockpile that can respond to those type of crises. We do have a small stockpile of goods now, including some ventilators, some PPE and alike. But moving forward, NATO has to be able to respond to crises and disasters autonomously, particularly if we're in a collective defense situation. The pandemic exposed multiple vulnerabilities across many dimensions of domestic resilience. Domestic resilience is also tied to allied resilience. So, and this is what we're working on as we speak. So one of the lessons, we talk about lessons and moving forward. I got to go back to the 2010 strategic concept. The 2010 strategic concept said exactly, to be effective across the crisis spectrum, we will enhance integrated civil military planning throughout the crisis spectrum. And this talks to a whole of government approach. It talks to a NATO approach. It talks to how we do planning and understand the second and third order effects of crises and actions itself. For instance, the stated aim of the NATO involvement in COVID-19, of course, it's a civil crisis, it's a global health crisis, but our objective was to prevent a health crisis from becoming a security crisis. And I have to take a look at it. I don't think we're there yet. We're multiple waves of the pandemic. We still have fragmented, economies, just societal cohesion. Still some resilience work in national institutions. And as there's fissures across the geopolitical space, the second and third order effects of the pandemic, I can probably suggest that we are not clear of a security crisis at this point. I want to kind of just frame things up using some hashtags that you might see on Twitter or the likes, and I'll hashtag out my perspective of the COVID-19. Hashtag international crisis. Hashtag nationalism. Hashtag selfish. Hashtag every man for themselves. Hashtag COVID exhausted. Hashtag new normal. Hashtag deglobalization. Hashtag we are NATO. And that I will wrap up and pass on to the next speaker.
Thank you so much, Tim. I like this way of ending a presentation. It's very creative. And I also am taking notes as I see more and more cross-cutting themes emerging. Certainly, resilience is one of those themes that keeps popping up in presentations, and rightfully so, and at different levels. Our fourth panelist today is Dr. Beth Greener, and it's the middle of the night basically for Dr. Greener. So thank you so much for signing in at this hour and for staying with us. I really appreciate it. Dr. Greener is an associate professor at Massey University and brings a perspective from New Zealand. So thank you so much once again, Dr. Greener, the floor is yours.
You're very welcome, and thank you for the invitation. Just at this stage, actually, we've just got the dawn chorus happening right outside with a whole lot of birds, so it's actually quite pleasant. I'm mindful of time, so I'm going to focus on just a few key things. One of the, I can add some hashtags to the previous speaker, because here in New Zealand, the hashtags have been things like Be Kind and Team of 5 Million. So the attitude has been very different, partly shaped in because of social cohesion being high in the light of a number of crises before the pandemic hit. So I'm going to briefly talk about some of the context, but focus in on particularly the role of the New Zealand Defence Force in Protect, which is the name of the current engagement for the NZDF. So in terms of context, I'll move quite quickly. So apologies to the translators. But essentially, we sat here at the bottom of the world and saw what was happening. And in January 2020, stood up our national security system, readying for the need to do something in the light of COVID. We had our first reported case on the 28th of February 2020. So we were quite late to the party. And the government moved very quickly, closing the borders on the 19th of March, introducing a new system for New Zealanders to have to become familiar with in terms of a tiered system, 4 different levels, level 1 being normal life, level 4 being very restricted movement of populations, and a whole array of other requirements. That was introduced on the 21st of March. We were informed we were in level 2. But on the 23rd of March, we were told we were going to be moving very swiftly. And on the 25th of March, we moved to alert level 4 and a national emergency was declared. So it was a very quick response to essentially locking down the country and locking down movement within the country. So the talk of hashtags, it was go hard and go early. And there was an elimination strategy, essentially, which a number of other countries were quite curious about. But by the 8th of June, so we were in lockdown on the 25th of March, but by the 8th of June 2020, we'd had a number of days with 0 cases. And so we returned to level 1. And what enabled us to do that was, having closed the borders, was then managing cases coming in. And that's when we began to see the NZDF take on a significant role. So the early stages were all very much civil agencies, so predominantly the Ministry of Health, Civil Defence and Emergency Management, and the Commissioner of Police, working with that said, there's always been NZDF personnel helping with planning and logistics in the background. And also the big thing is the personnel that have been provided under these conditions. So again, as I said, I'm mindful of time. Essentially, elimination, we're starting to move away from that. We had cases come in because we opened a trans-Tasman bubble with Australia and when we had begun vaccination rollout. So we're moving more towards a management sort of scheme. There's been significant change in the last 12 hours. It's been announced that the system that we currently have, we will be moving away from requiring everybody coming in to be in managed isolation and quarantine facilities for 14 days, returning 3 COVID tests over that time. And those facilities, there are 32 of them across the country in 5 different cities, are predominantly staffed by NZDF. So you can begin to see the scale of commitment. So at the moment, there are 961 personnel deployed on OpProtect. However, those are the people actively deployed. There are currently 1,267 personnel, as of a couple of days ago anyway, who basically are committed, either readying to deploy or standing down after that deployment. So the biggest thing for the New Zealand Defence Force has been this involvement in staffing managed isolation and quarantine facilities. So of those 961, over 900 of them are in MIQ. They can be in headquarters, but they can also be performing security roles on site. Perimeter security is particularly contentious topic, as we have had people trying to escape and run away from these facilities. So these are essentially contracted hotels. So most of the staff on site are hotel staff, but there's also health in terms of looking after health and wellbeing, Ministry of Social Development, police, and private security as well. So the NZDF personnel make up 16% of the staff on site. Hotel staff, that's the second biggest contingent behind hotel staff. They are there and able to legally enforce directions under our Public Health Response Act that was brought in 2020. So that's been really interesting. So they do have their power of enforcement officers. And in terms of other commitments that they're or support, so the new NZDF is very much an agency in support. And that has been made quite clear. So even our highest ranking NZDF person at the moment, who's Brigadier Rose King, they are currently seconded to the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment, which is the lead agency with overall accountability for the MIQ system in particular. Very briefly, other NZDF commitments, in addition to staffing those facilities, helping with maritime borders. They have the capacity to enter buildings, to board ships, request information, staffing vehicle checkpoints, because currently most of the country is in level 2, but Auckland and Waikato are in level 3, which means that people cannot cross those borders without clearance. So those are being staffed by police, supported by NZDF. There's also obviously been a huge amount of logistical support in securing PPE and repatriating people, and in also we've got Defence Estate being used as quarantine sites. The other really significant piece of the puzzle is the NZDF's role in delivering vaccines into the Pacific. So thinking about that broader geopolitical situation. Very briefly, the scale of the commitment. It's going to be quite shocking to North American audiences who don't know a lot about New Zealand. So we are a team of 5 million, but we have less than 10,000 in the NZDF regular force. Army is essentially a brigade at 4,500-ish. Air Force is essentially a single fixed wing rotary squadron at 2,500-ish personnel. Navy just over 2,000 personnel, 2 frigates are the mainstay, a new big icebreaker vessel and small patrol vessels. So the thing is Op Protect since August 2020, and we're now October 2021, has been the largest deployment that the NZDF has fielded since East Timor. And not only that, it's the kind of the longest running in terms of that tempo of commitment. So consequences, very briefly, attrition is a concern. In February this year, the Chief of Defence Force, Air Marshal Kevin Short, said didn't believe attrition was necessarily an issue, but recent exit surveys have demonstrated that 136 staff exited recently and 17% identified Op Protect as an important or somewhat important reason for leaving. Army is probably going to be hardest hit. They tend to be disproportionately represented in these deployments, and certain trades are in significant demand. We have a shortage of skilled workers in places, things like electrical fitters. There's questions about morale. Families are finding it hard. Rotations are very high. It depends on the unit, how they free up those people, but often you can be 4 weeks away, 4 weeks back. Again, it will vary between unit, and there will be disproportionate impacts on different units, on different trades, gendered impacts, and also ethnicity related impacts probably forthcoming as well. The Chief of Defence Force has expressed concerns about skill fade. So this is something which has come up in terms of this being a commitment which is taken people out for almost 2 years of some of their regular jobs. Also, there's been a lot of commentary about the strain that would be placed on the NZDF to respond to any other significant incidents such as Haydar at home or in the Pacific. We have concurrently, we did concurrently run the Afghanistan extraction and also respond to floods and things like that, but anything of significant numbers that we would struggle. There are also career issues, training and coursing potentially interrupted. And also there's the opposition spokesperson has said there's a strong reliance on particular staff, particularly senior staff, so there could be an impact on the raise, train and sustain functions. So we're in a phase of thinking about regeneration. As I said 12 hours ago, it's possible that this whole system will change. They've said within weeks that the MIQ system should shift. But then there's that issue, which was mentioned at the very beginning, about there's a bubble now in the hydraulics and a concern about what that might mean. We've had, if we think about junior officers, if their main experience has been in hotels, at this point in time, that could be a little bit tricky. But it's also, the thing for me is I'm ever the optimist. Yes, there may have been skill fade on some things, but soft skills and discipline has been really significant. It's possible that some of the people who were leaving, if we're increasingly doing this type of operation, it could be important to see who's able to be resilient in the face of these demands. And there's an opportunity for significant change because we've had, it's the regeneration projects which we could pursue. Everything has been placed up in the air. So if there was an interest in force structure changes or the integration of lessons learned from the interagency work, then there's an opportunity in a crisis as well. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Beth. And I see a parallel there between the NZDF's regeneration plan and the Canadian Armed Forces reconstitution plan, and certainly some of the reasons behind the military personnel strains there might be similar. I do have some questions for all of the panelists, and then I have some questions that are specific to individual panelists, and we'll go in reverse order. So I will start with Dr. Greener for responding to those questions, and we'll work our way back to Major General Saint-Louis. So the first question I have is from Colonel Richard Garon, or Richard Garon, and he asks, to any or all panelists, comprehensive and whole of government approaches have been discussed and analyzed for the last 20 years, mainly for international interventions, but it has been considered a flavor of the month. During the current pandemic, national responses and resilience has been improved by our previous experiences and knowledge of these approaches. In light of these more recent events, should we reinforce our understanding and practices of the comprehensive approach and the whole of government approach? And yesterday it was even referred to as the whole of nation approach. So I'd be really interested to hear from all of the panelists on this, starting with Dr. Greener. And then I'll throw in my own question with the benefit of hindsight and as it applies to your individual presentations, knowing what you know now. Is there something that should have been done differently in your view? And if so, what is it? So throwing that in as a challenge question, and we'll start with Dr. Greener.
Gosh, those are both really good questions. Again, I think there's a luxury in the scale here in New Zealand in terms of you can literally, everybody knows everybody. It's a little bit of an in-joke, but it does lend itself to a whole of government approach. And we've had some significant national crises, such as the 2011 Christchurch earthquake, which saw NZDF patrolling cordons on the street. And we have fairly high levels of trust in our security forces, both police and military. So I think in New Zealand, we're lucky we start ahead simply because of the size of everything. So whole of government is a necessity here. because of capacity. But I like that idea of whole of nation. So in 2017, when New Zealand did its largest home-based military exercise, runs every 2 years, well, not at the moment, exercise Southern Karapo, there was a real emphasis on bringing in non-governmental organizations, agencies. So to try and see, you know, as kind of thinking about these capabilities, particularly because our strongest interest is the Pacific. So then the idea of being able to leverage off all possible partners is quite important here. In terms of your question, Stephanie, there was a lot of talk here about building the plane whilst flying it, that this was uncharted territory. There are some interesting issues in and around. So there was a legal challenge about the way the government handled things. In fact, the High Court came back and said, yes, some things were unlawful but justified. And there, I think one of the biggest issues, that we're facing is also in and around questions. We've alluded to them already. The broader questions of social cohesion, trust, and government is a really significant one. I think that was well maintained. The communication with the public was very well maintained. In terms of doing anything differently, I've actually been advocating for quite a long time that other agencies need to step up, because the NZDF, the list is too long, it was already too long in terms of the tasks that were being required of it. And we weren't particularly recognizing that. And we kept adding to that list over the years. And so I have wanted for a long time for there to be other civil agencies build some capacity. And not very long ago, CDEM, so Civil Defence, was talking about having fly-in and fly-out teams. Just timing-wise, I'm not sure, those haven't yet kind of been made manifest, but the Ministry of Health now has fly-out teams. So it's starting to think about what are the roles that we want military to play, and if we don't want to be adding more and more to their plate, who else is going to do that job? And do we have the capability and capacity? So yeah, I worry about the one-stop shop for the military, but for all sorts of reasons. Yeah, and I think that could have been addressed a little more here in this context. But overall, we've been very lucky. We've had, again, just for the numbers, we've had 5,462 cases of COVID here and 28 deaths. So we're also, again, psychologically in a very different position, I think, from a lot of the rest of the world. So there's huge ramifications from those sorts of things. Anyway, I'll be quiet now, but thank you for your questions.
And thanks for the thoughtful answer. I was also struck in your presentation at the range of military tasks that you listed for the New Zealand Defence Force. I found that quite astonishing. Before I turn over to you, Tim, I must confess that I have a couple more questions for you that are tailored for your presentation specifically, and you may have seen them in the Q&A, but I'll ask them here because I think it's coming from one of the panelists from yesterday. So it may not be visible to you, but Quinn Lucy gave a presentation yesterday, and then he's got these questions for you. Did the various requests for assistance create a conflict for resources between requesters? And if so, did you create a process to handle them? And second, did you ever build visibility for specific supply chains, such as for key PPE items, to track worldwide availability and their distribution within applicable NATO countries? And if you did, what tools did you leverage or create to do so? So maybe 3 additional questions. Over to you, Tim.
Okay, should I tackle the comprehensive approach question first?
Tackle any questions.
Okay.
The order that you wish. That's your prerogative as a panel.
Okay, maybe I'll wrap up on the comprehensive approach one then first. But the conflict for resources between requesters, that's a great question. We are very fortunate that we did not run into any of those conflicts, primarily how we are structured and how we delivered response. One, our clearinghouse mechanism. A request comes into us. We publish that request to the 30 allies and 39 partners, and they decide whether they want to respond to that request or not. So it was left out of our hands as deciding. So if, you know, country X wanted to respond, they would respond. So, but from the stockpile and the trust fund response, the pandemic response trust fund that we had, that could have caused more issues than it actually did. So the stockpile, we were fortunate enough for right away to get 200 ventilators gifted to us, the stockpile from the United States. And there was a large request and large demand for ventilators at the early stage of the pandemic. Anything that left the stockpile, it was a council decision on that being delivered to allies or partners. The stockpile itself was primarily for an allied response, but if there were no allies and partners needed it, the allies in the North Atlantic Council would decide whether they, provided the goods from the stockpile or not. So that type of competition, it didn't come to a head. We did have one nation that had requested ventilators from us. They had asked us how many we had left, and we said, we gave them the amount, and that was their request to us, the exact amount. And they also requested a larger amount from the EU mechanism. So they were after more ventilators than we could have provided. As it worked out, we had no issues. So, but some of the projects we've developed, that is the area where we could have got into trouble, but our criteria for delivering a project was, one, they had an open request for assistance from us, and we had resources, funding available to deliver a project, and the goods were available on the market. So that kind of leads me to the second question, is the visibility of supply chains. We have no purchase procurement authority ourselves within the EADRCC. Our response has been a NATO enterprise response. The NATO Support and Procurement Agency has been our executing agent on 90% of our projects. And they have had the good visibility with the industry on where items were available that we needed, particularly the PPE. As we rolled on and the supply chains become a little bit more responsive, NSPA had constantly provided us an update, and they had on what was available and out there, and they had established contract agreements with these organizations that would have to deliver the goods within 14 days primarily. So we had no issues there. So I hope that answers, Quinn, both the questions that you've asked. With regards to the comprehensive approach, I see it from a different perspective, because I see it from a NATO policy perspective initially. So when I arrived at NATO in 2007, the talk of the day was the comprehensive approach, NATO's contribution to the comprehensive approach of the international community. And a lot of this had evolved from, how we were doing or how we were responding and doing our projects and engagements in Afghanistan, because it took a lot more than just the military. We were talking the 3D approach, development, defense, and I even forget the D, the 3 Ds. Okay, so from the Alliance perspective, we looked about how we were working with other international organizations, but in our policy, we were guiding and hoping that nations would pick up on the whole of government approach that was required for responses from nations. So some governments were very good at this, but I'll tell you, in 2010, there were not that many joint operation centers, national joint operation centers. But move forward to the 2014 era, where we had Russia do a land grab with Ukraine, we have seen an increasing number of nations formulating a whole of government approaches, particularly in their national joint operations centers. So we've seen a large improvement in that. One of the things I can take in from the comprehensive approach perspective, ask me what I can see improved here, is a NATO internal comprehensive approach. So this is one of the things that, you know, we're a large alliance. We have many different divisions focused on different elements, very stovepiped in how we deliver as an organization, and an internal comprehensive approach would be a way forward. And the UN did this when we were looking at our contribution to a comprehensive approach. The UN was looking at their integrated mission planning process and how they delivered from their own package and how they delivered comprehensively on their individual programs. So I think I've kind of given you my perspective on that, but huge promoter of the whole of government and whole of nation approach. So thank you for those questions.
Thank you so much, Tim. I would turn it over to Elizabeth Braw right now. However, I don't see her signed in. I think that there may be some connection issues. I think I'm correct. So I will go straight over to Major General Saint-Louis.
Merci, Stéphanie. Je vais essayer de répondre aux deux questions.
Thank you, Stéphanie. I'll try and answer both questions. I'll start with the comprehensive approach.
I disagree with the premise of the question as it's being asked. If comprehensive approach and making militaries understand how they work within other departments and civilian stakeholders to deliver an effect for our country, well, that flavor of the month has become flavor of the year and flavor of the decade. Like I've had that flavor on my menu for years. I had an exercise on domestic operations, a week-long exercise when I trained as a staff captain, and under a different context. It wasn't the context of a pandemic, but coming together to deliver an effect in a domestic context to help a nation's department or ministry tackling a security-related problem. We were taught that as a captain. We did it for the Vancouver Olympics. I've deployed forces in the thousands for helping the Quebec and Ontario people tackling floods. And again, so je vous dirais, à Monsieur.
So I would say, especially, I would say to Colonel Garon, that the comprehensive approach
within our professional development construct, within our role when deployed, as I did capacity building in Kabul, delivering it through a whole of government approach. And then even when I went back to Afghanistan to fight, I was fighting under a comprehensive approach where one day we were delivering a dam, we were delivering vaccines, we were delivering schooling and fighting the enemy at the same time. Like the Canadian military, the Canadian Army, who I speak for, we study that. What I would say in answer to that is who needs more comprehensive approach? And maybe that's the premise of the question. As a country, Canada gets 1 or 2 students in our National Strategic Studies program in Toronto, where we train to talk about strategy and the delivery of effects. In a cohort of 20-25 security professionals, department mid-level and senior managers make up 1 or 2 students a year. Different than some other countries where the civilian dependencies, interdependencies, as they develop les cadres supérieurs, much more attuned to the use of the different elements of power in a country. I think we're a different country. Our different departments do not think about the use of military power as a lever within our construct in the same way that maybe it is used in other countries. So I would turn back and say, it is not the flavor of the month in the Canadian Army. At least it hasn't been my experience. And I think there might be some hard lessons to be learned within our national resiliency, our departments, our ministries, our governments, provincial and federal going forward. That's for the first part. La deuxième, Madame, you're putting me on the spot. What could I have done better? Like go listen to my spouse. The list is like this and it gets bigger every day. God, I would say one thing. And I will keep it within my authorities and responsibilities, because God forbid I would go on the record of pointing fingers of who could have been better. The Army could have been better in explaining the case, in making the case, in explaining why it still needs to generate readiness during a time of the pandemic. We were very good corporate citizens in abiding by federal and provincial policies of isolation, federal and provincial policies of diminuer les déplacements, diminuer the gatherings. And you cannot generate Army readiness by not going to Gagetown, to the training center, or going to Wainwright, to the Maneuver Training Center, or coming to Kingston, to the Canadian Army Command and Staff College. You cannot generate Army readiness if you do not aggregate teams and train together to be ready for whatever comes next. But we were good at respecting and very, very quick to respect federal and provincial and local guidance. And we did not want to be the vector of the pandemic by which we would spread the virus. We did not want to be criticized for not being absolutely perfectly in respect and in lock and step with policy. And I would say that it was different when I talked to other Army commanders, either in the US Army or in the British Army or in the French Army, where they were able to make the case that this is a national tool, instrument of power that needs to continue to operate under exception or different circumstances. And they did not completely stop the training and generation of land power the way we did. If you ask me what I would have done better, I would have made it a stronger case and advocated for the Army's ability to continue to generate readiness no matter what, because I really like bringing it back to one of the questions or one of the points made by a panelist after me. And that is, what if we would have had to go fight somewhere while delivering the pandemic? What if an adversary had taken advantage of the last 18 or 20 months to take part of a state and occupy it, or attack us across multi-domains, and then the hard power that we generate would have been needed somewhere else? That cette pratique de devenir,
this practice of being very respectful of policy,
not see the Army as different and an essential requirement going forward. I think that I would have tried to do better, ma'am and team.
Thank you. That's a powerful statement. And I think that you're right. Readiness is one of those hard-learned lessons. And just on the whole of government point, I just want to point to a comment that was made by our U.S. Army War College visiting defense fellow here at Queen's. And he added that, yes, increasingly in the U.S. DoD, a comprehensive whole of government is losing its luster, especially after the failure in Afghanistan when civilian agencies failed to deliver. So a perspective here coming from a U.S. Army colonel with regards to, another space where lessons are being learned and reintegrated vis-a-vis Afghanistan. We are almost.
Can I just address that?
Please.
And obviously, I did not have enough time to put thought to it as I did by listening to the other speakers before I answered. So there's a danger I get it wrong. But I hear that comment from your student from the U.S. Army. And I would say, for me, what has lost luster is the belief that you can capacity your build out of a security problem. That's what I think is up now for discussion. Can you capacity build yourself out of a national interest, real power dynamic? Can you capacity build your way out of countries and state and non-state actors having interests that are at odds with each other? Not so much that the effort that you do across whatever domain, I think that still needs to be a comprehensive whole of government approach. And the pandemic has shown me that. You cannot only use one element of power to address this. But I think it is the hanging our hat on capacity building as the solution for everything. That, I would agree, merits attention, but not the whole of government comprehensive approach, ma'am.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you so much. And this is really the value of the way that the conference and the panels are built, bringing perspectives from different countries, bringing perspectives from different organizations. I really see the richness of that since yesterday and on this panel, which I've just been delighted to chair. I've learned so much and taking so many notes. It gives us lots of room to think through the policy briefs that we'll write. And I know we've got lots of material here with what you've shared today. So to all four panelists, thank you for really excellent presentations, and the complementarity of the four presentations too were remarkable. And thank you for your nimble answers in the Q&A period as well. So thanks again, and I will turn it over now to Colonel Teller.
Thank you, Stephanie. That does bring to a close our second day of KCIS. I'd like to make a few thank yous here. First, to our IT and admin team in the background for making this run so smoothly today. For the audience for joining us and engaging in the Q&A sessions. The chairs for teasing out the nuance we were hoping for, and most importantly, the panelists just for sharing your insight, your perspective, and your knowledge on this, this subject, which cannot be more topical. We've reached the halfway point in KCIS. It's been a wonderful couple of days. I've always been told not to promise anything as a uniform member, but I do promise more of the same for the coming days. And I invite you to join us tomorrow for the land forces implications and a bit of a discussion on supply chain. And we will continue the conversation. Thank you for joining us. Good afternoon, and I do look forward to seeing you tomorrow.